Hello again. I want to start this lecture by looking at the claims made by the British government about what the EU means for UK immigration and border control policy. Basically, the pro-EU message from the government's official leaflet recommending a vote to remain is both positive as well as defensive. The defensive aspect comes across in this caption on the left, which says that the UK is in control of its own borders because it is not in the border-free travel area. I mentioned this area, also known as Schengen, in the introductory video for this week's topic. Now, being outside of Schengen's borderless space allows the UK to have passport checks at its borders and to avoid participating in shared EU asylum rules covering visas for non-EU citizens. It also means the UK doesn't participate in relocation schemes for Syrian and other migrants in an EU-wide fashion. Nevertheless, the fundamental right of EU citizens to move freely around the EU, one of the four principles on which the single market is based, has got great implications for UK border control. For a start, it means there is no UK citizens only queue at British airports. Well, to do so would be to discriminate against EU nationals. More importantly, there is a presumptive right for citizens of other EU countries to enter the UK in order to work or study. Since the enlargement of the EU to include Central and Eastern European countries in 2004, many EU citizens have chosen to come to the UK. This is what this image shows us. It's using data collected by the EU's data research organisation Eurostat, telling us then that as of 2015, the UK has 3 million residents born in another EU country. That is 4.6% of the total British population. That's 50% higher than the EU average, but it's lower than a number of other countries, such as Cyprus, Ireland, or Belgium. They're higher up on the list because their average population made up of citizens from other EU countries is higher. Also note that because Norway and Switzerland have accepted the free movement of people principle as part of their economic relationship with the EU, these two countries have a significant proportion of EU-born citizens in their population. With so many EU citizens exercising their right to study or work abroad, there are clear repercussions for the UK's criminal justice and border controls. But there are exceptions to the free movement principle. If a government believes there is a justification based on public policy, public health, or public security, a citizen of another EU country can be denied entry. This denial can only be assessed on an individual case-by-case basis. Since 2010, the UK has refused entry to around 6,000 EU citizens, so it is a power that is being used. Denying entry to an EU citizen is dependent on accessing information about criminality and suspected illegal activity. This is part of the positive message that the UK government is seeking to emphasise about the EU. If we look again at the government's official pro-EU leaflet, it makes the claim that EU membership benefits UK security by providing much needed cooperation to tackle transnational threats. Despite not being in Schengen, the UK has access to the Schengen Information System, which is a database enabling police forces to access alerts on wanted criminals and stolen property. It is also possible to use this system to ask for background checks, but that is not automatic. Given the amount of EU migration into Britain, having the ability to check for outstanding police alerts is both logical and highly useful. The Schengen database itself is closely connected to another feature of EU membership that the government argues is beneficial to UK interests. the European arrest warrant that is mentioned here on the right in this image, which again is taken from the government's official pro-EU leaflet. Indeed, it was the UK that pushed for this policy, which entails the standardization across Europe of the rules for returning wanted suspects to the country in which they are accused of a crime. This has led to a great reduction in the time taken to bring criminals to justice and means there is much less chance for them to escape justice owing to a lack of police cooperation. Of course, extradition of suspected criminals between countries is not unique to the EU. However, in the EU, it is a much faster process. Prior to the launch of the European arrest warrant, it took an average of 12 months for justice systems to cooperate in conflictual cases. Now the average is down to 48 days. Norway and Iceland are essentially members of the European arrest warrant scheme, but this reflects the fact that they also participate in Schengen. There is the possibility of the UK finding an agreement to continue using the European arrest warrant without being an EU member, just as it accesses the Schengen database without being in the borderless space. It would be then another aspect of the negotiation for the terms of withdrawing from the EU and requiring the consent of other EU countries. Another problem that will be opened up by a British withdrawal concerns asylum policy. Although the UK has its own asylum and visa rules, there is an aspect of UK asylum law that is covered by the EU's Dublin regulation. What this rule establishes is that any asylum seeker entering the EU has to submit their application for asylum in the first EU country they enter. Once their details, namely their fingerprints, are registered in the first country of entry, other governments have the right to return these asylum seekers if they cross a border into another EU country. The Dublin system thereby prevents asylum shopping by preventing anyone from registering for asylum in more than one country. Now, this rule is potentially of great benefit to countries that might be attractive for asylum seekers, but which are not likely to be the first entry point into the EU. That's definitely the situation of the UK. However, it's important to bear in mind that the UK carried out only 252 Dublin transfers in 2014. The vast majority of failed asylum deportations from the UK thus involved transfers to non-EU countries, which is probably why the government has not mentioned this policy as a reason to stay in the EU in its leaflet. One border-related issue that has featured more prominently in the referendum debate is the UK arrangement with France over immigration protocols that apply to channel crossings. As we can see from this headline, in February, Prime Minister David Cameron warned that leaving the EU would lead to the establishment of migrant camps in the Dover area. Now, this news story relates to a specific aspect of UK border policy that is covered by the 2003 Treaty of Le Touquet with France. It is this treaty that allows UK authorities to be based at French ferry ports in order to carry out passport checks. A similar rule applies for the Channel Tunnel. In effect, this system means the UK border authorities can filter out travellers without proper documentation, thereby reducing the number of people able to claim asylum upon landing on British soil. Now, that's a big advantage, as the French authorities otherwise have an incentive to allow people to transit to Britain, because then they become someone else's responsibility. We have already witnessed this dynamic at play in the Schengen area during 2015, when countries basically allowed asylum seekers to transit to Germany and Sweden for the most part. In the absence of such an agreement, it is not obvious that there would be migrant camps in the UK, like the ones that currently exist around port terminals in the Channel Tunnel in France. However, relying on French border controls is a risk, as it would deprive the UK of the means to filter out potential asylum seekers. Nevertheless, it is important to highlight that the Le Touquet Treaty is a bilateral agreement that has no relation to the EU or to EU law. In principle, nothing stops this arrangement from continuing after a Brexit. What it depends on is the willingness of the French government to stick to the deal, which is an unknown quantity, although some officials have warned the deal would unravel in the case of Britain leaving the EU. Overall, therefore, the security arguments relating to staying in the EU for the purposes of border control are pretty technical. Unlike sovereignty arguments, there does not seem to be an important political principle at stake. And unlike economic justifications, there isn't an impact on jobs or take-home pay. This is an opportunity to reflect perhaps in your private journal as to whether you've come across these security-related arguments in the campaign so far. In the next section, I will examine the debate raging over the more fundamental principle of whether the UK should continue to accept the EU's free movement of people principle.